Good morning, folks. Real pleasure to have Tom Ryan of TKR Consulting Associates. Tom and I were colleagues at Gartner in the late 90s. My God, it's been that long. But I have always admired his knowledge of supply chain execution. So warehousing, transportation, et cetera, logistics in general. So Tom, welcome aboard. Thanks for joining me. Tell the audience a little more about your career. In the whole label licking, how did you describe yourself? You
A label licker, box kicker, yeah.
Right.
I after leaving the Army decades ago, I went to work for Procter & Gamble as a warehouse operations manager, and was involved with them in that capacity, as well as in maintenance, manufacturing maintenance and manufacturing engineering roles as well, over a 10.5-year career with them. And I ended up working for a small consultancy company where we tested control systems for material handling environments and warehousing operations. And that ultimately led me to be at a WMS company. And in that environment, kind of started a multi-vendor experience, but essentially helping design and implement warehousing systems, probably 20 of them, where the warehouses were as small as 150,000 square feet and as large as a million plus. So very interesting environment. Ultimately ended up after that as a research director with you at Gartner. I know myself and two others at Gartner were the first ones to start what they called the Integrated Logistics Strategy Service. It's morphed a little bit, as we all know, from that era. And there was a reprise of that role, if you will, as a vice president of supply chain research when I was at Aberdeen Group. When I left Gartner, I went to work for a brand new startup third-party logistics company. And my joke is I put their money where my Gartner mouth was and went and built the architecture for a new 3PL, doing what I told everybody at Gartner that they ought to be doing, and then 2 years later breathed a deep sigh of relief and realized that I had not been lying to everybody, because it actually did work. So now I'm involved in a lot of, let's just call it general supply chain consulting kind of activity. A lot of that has been focused at enterprise software selection, many different areas, not just ERP, but warehousing, transportation, third-party logistics partners, who you can partner with, and how would you go about selecting somebody like that. And on occasion, actually back into the business of screwing in software. So helping manage from the client's perspective, not from the vendor perspective, the implementations.
So you're still keeping your hands dirty, and you're still kicking those boxes, and you're still licking those labels.
You got that right.
Tom, well, good to have you on board. It's been, in all the doom and gloom in the last 4 or 5 months, it's actually been an amazing time for innovation, hasn't it? I mean, we're seeing auto companies jump in and try to make ventilators. We've seen banks process 4 million PPP loans in 6 weeks. We've seen 3M try to quadruple N95 mass production. We've seen all kinds of last mile logistics heroics, right? So tell a little bit from your perspective, what has made you go, wow, I didn't think this was doable in the last few months?
Well, part of the challenge with supply chains from imposed on by the pandemic, quite honestly, it's driven more by, I think, the nature of it starting in China. And not only was it starting in China, it started in China and it spread to the rest of the world at the same time that we had all this tariff and trade negotiations business going on, which was actually beginning to upset things before the pandemic came along. And when you get into supply chains that are dealing with that long a distance, you have complexity to begin with. I mean, when you sit back and realize that the fastest you can get something, if you're not air freighting it, is more than 30 days with it sitting on a boat somewhere in the Pacific, it's difficult. And planning for, it's hard enough to plan demand and be able to replenish demand, the old saw of right inventory, right place, right time. that's hard enough when you can deal with, continental US type lengths of supply chain. But you throw in all the overseas stuff and the multiplicity of overseas stuff, whether it be China, Japan, Indonesia, India, it gets really hard. And then the shutdowns really started to play out. But quite honestly, the shutdowns that occurred there were not all that dissimilar with a labor strike on the Longshoremen's Union on the West Coast. You had the same difficulty. Stuff wasn't moving. And then how do you anticipate for that? Inventory is expensive. And you can't just plan on it. But at the same time, how can you plan for a once in 100-year upset like this was? So that's where I think the most of the challenge has been. And, that might be migrating more as we move forward to reducing dependency on incredibly long supply chains. I know we've talked about possibly talking about this some, where, bringing manufacturing back, shortening your supply chain. In an environment where we have customers that expect product tomorrow, you got to shorten your supply chain. Yep. And that may be compensated by reducing your freight costs because you're not hauling it long distances. It may be reduced, your costs for using North American suppliers instead of cheaper overseas suppliers. You may be able to offset that or mitigate that by inventory reductions or different types of contracts with the suppliers that you're dealing with.
So Tom, let's go down by industry, right? Because it just seems like we've had multiple industries affected by supply chain issues. So let's tackle healthcare first. And it seems like PPE, ventilators, even medical personnel, we had to ship them across the country. It just seemed chaotic, the whole healthcare supply chain, right? Do you think we've learned a lot from that? It'll be different going forward. Describe a little bit of what happened in healthcare.
Well, I think that part of what we've learned there is why should we be surprised by a once in 100-year lifetime type of thing causing chaos and confusion? But at the same time, I think we learned that some of the reasons we put together backup plans and contingency plans is because these things may happen. And at the same time, you need to carry forward with the plans you have. So for example, don't drain down your stockpiles for an emergency and not replenish them. A lot of the states, some of the Fed as well, pulled down their PPE backup supplies for crises like this because of the bird flu, H1N1, and the SARS and stuff like that occurred, and they just never got around to actually spending the money. It's kind of like having been a maintenance manager where people don't want to spend the money to maintain the machines, and then they wonder why it's so expensive when they finally do break, because you've been putting it off and putting it off. So from that point of view, you have that activity going on. The other thing that's interesting is the shortages in the PPE. The PPE in its own shape and form, personal protective equipment, isn't that complex.
Yep.
So being able to all of a sudden say, well, I'm not buying it from China anymore. I'm going to stand up my factories, or for 3M, where 2/3 of their manufacturing was in China, but they did have manufacturing here in the States, they were able to ramp up a relatively simple manufacturing process. It's amazing. It's been amazing to me how basically seamstress or sewing type operations proliferate. I visited a manufacturer of bulletproof vests for the military a few years back, and it dawned on me when I walked out, I had really visited a garment shop.
Yep.
Kind of weird materials that they were using, but it was essentially a garment shop. When you look at the activities associated with a sanitizer, we had we've got this whole growing, budding industry of artisanal brewers, artisanal distillers, and they're sitting here going, well, heck, I make alcohol all the time. what else do I have to put in this to make it a sanitizer? And they were able to shift over. And, I mean, they were able to help fill in the gap. I think the thing that we should look at that in that regard is that this is just another demonstration, and it can sound jingoistic, but the creativity of the American people and American industry, especially small industry, to step into the, we used to say in the military, step into the breach, once more into the breach.
You know, on the PPE side.
Ventilators is a different story. Those are really complex machines. Yep. And having the federal government kick off the same type of national program that we did for World War II, with basically forcing manufacturers to get into that business, really did seem to help.
Yeah, on PPE, I had a great interview with an R&D company called Mattel, and they pulled out, they had, for the CDC, done a study on when the Ebola crisis occurred a few years ago.
Yeah.
And you disinfect N95s at scale. And it went nowhere because, the scale wasn't needed. They pulled that out, and the governor of Ohio called President Trump, who told the FDA to fast track it. They have disinfected in 3 months 2 million N95 masks. So that's another way to generate PPE supply, right? So you're right. People have been incredibly ingenious. Let's talk about another industry where I think the logistics seems to have worked very well, which is last mile delivery. So we've all been working from home. I mean, the Amazon Prime deliveries have arrived, food, Instacart deliveries of food have arrived, the Domino's deliveries have arrived. Couldn't have happened overnight, right? Why has last mile logistics worked so well, at least in the US?
Well, I think the thing to remember with last mile logistics is it's essentially local. And depending upon, and when we look at most of what is being delivered, it doesn't need 18-wheelers. It doesn't need big pieces of capital equipment. DoorDash, I mean, it's a car. I mean, how many cars do we have? And the idea, again, of people, quite honestly, looking for survival on the restaurant side. How do I survive? People can't come to me. How can I get them to go out? You know what? I'm going to get into this takeout order business that I wasn't really focused on before. I mean, and I'm going to figure out how to do it. And now I've got to do it in a way where I've got delivery, or I'm tied into delivery people. And I need to do it in a way that makes it as much a pleasant experience as I can. So that comes back into everything you need to have a meal like you would have had at my restaurant, you can have at home. They thought about how to do that in order to get people to come back to them and not just do the drive-through. Now, in the United States, fortunately, we do have a lot of drive-throughs, and so we've got a lot of people that are used to doing that. But I do know of a couple once where the wife said, it's not a date if the building has a drive-through. So, so you've got that. To me, it's the creativity of local people. Now, when you get into organizations like Amazon or a lot of the other big box stores that are, they've been trying to figure out or have been refining their processes for doing last mile for a long time. What was different for them was volume, not concept. And so, again, with the exception of some bigger pieces, things that you might want to buy, you didn't need specialty equipment. You don't have to have a lift gate on the back end of the truck because you're not carrying something that big. I mean, if you look at Amazon's new fleet, it's all, step vans. And if you look at a lot of the, FedEx trucks and UPS trucks, I mean, UPS has specialty vehicles, but that's only because they chose to customize on that particular style. FedEx didn't go that route. They bought off the shelf equipment in large volume. But, you can get to do that. The other thing that's kind of interesting on this last mile is when you talk about the car dealerships. You've got the brand new car vending machine thing now. you know, or
Carvanas. Yeah.
Carvanas, and there's others that are out there where you can get your car delivered to your door.
Yeah.
I'm not one who's quite ready to go deliver, you know, buy a car online and then hope I like it when it gets here. But they've tried to accommodate that. So again, I think it comes back to creativity under pressure and how are people working to try to either expand their life beyond being locked up or save their business.
Talking about that, Tom, it's been really nice to see Shopify working with a bunch of 3PLs, allow a lot of small merchants to be able to continue to do their stuff, right?
Right.
And not just be dependent on what we used to call channel masters like Amazon and Walmart, right?
Right.
Do you think, is that model sustainable?
Well,
post-pandemic?
I mean, what model do you mean as being sustainable?
Not being dependent on an Amazon. I mean, a lot of merchants sell through Amazon, right? But
yeah,
Shopify has shown them another way to get to the consumer.
Right. I mean, and so the idea of, quite honestly, as a third-party logistics company and what they can provide sustainable, I think the short answer is yes. The second answer is if you're looking at being someone stepping into that marketplace, there are different flavors of 3PL. And so you have to shop for the one that meets the business requirement you need. And when you do that, well, I just went through a process where a manufacturer of basically supplies used in maintenance and upgrade and repair and remodel of a home, they manufactured 80% of what they sold and redistributed, you know, the other 20%. Well, they bought their biggest competitor, and that competitor was the flip. They made 20 and redistributed 80. So from a business fit, it was a really good fit for them. But then when they did this, they were both national, they were both in the same marketplace, and they realized that amongst the 9 warehouses the two of them had combined, they had double the coverage of the same geography because they had both had to cover the geography on their own before. And so then the CEO of the acquiring company told me, he said, look, we don't do distribution well, we're manufacturers. I think I need a 3PL to do this for me. And so then the game became, how do you cope with finding the right kind of 3PL that can take you from, ultimately we went from 9 distribution centers down to 3. How do you meet your service obligation? If you order today, I'll get it to you I'll ship today and it'll be to you within 2 days. How do you manage that service obligation? And how can you do that with a third party? It's a challenge, but it's doable. And, you know, you get into who's doing the warehousing, who's doing the inventory planning, who's doing the transportation management, all that stuff. Different 3PLs can do all those things. Not all 3PLs can do all those things.
And I imagine as you move to more of a B2C e-commerce model, reverse logistics is huge also, right? A lot of consumers.
Actually, reverse logistics is a challenge. There's no doubt about that. But from the 3PL point of view, reverse logistics is simply a shipment that started on the other end because you're bringing in an each. And maybe we'll talk about later on about some of this autonomous mobile robotics stuff. But in that environment where you've shipped out eaches, you're bringing back eaches, it's a put away. Now, it is a challenge to make sure it was validated, credited. You know, the accounting side is a challenge. And then the quality side. Did I get back what I did ship to them? And what is what condition is it in? Can I just put it away? That is an added complexity, especially when you're dealing with consumer returns.
So another industry that does not appear to have done too well is the whole food supply chain. It just seems like meatpacking plants had a bunch of COVID outbreaks. It just seems it wasn't as smooth as you would think. You know, farmers having to dump a bunch of surplus milk because schools were closed. It just seemed, maybe it's anecdotal, but I didn't get the sense that food supply chain was at its best in the last 3-4 months. Am I off base?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are types of food and parts of food that, you know, the food distribution operation has to deal in a very short timeline. You know, with the exception of frozen, you have limitations to how long it's good. And in the case of the food supply chain, it was as much a disruption of the consumption side as it was a disruption of the supply side. I'll come back to your point about milk. Dairy cows make milk all the time. You got to milk them. You have a supply that you got to do something with.
Yep.
When the consumption market goes away, what do you do with it? You know, you can only make so much cheese, okay? And the government in the past has been really good about buying surplus milk and turning it into cheese and then giving the cheese to old timers, I guess. I don't know what you do with all that surplus cheese. But, you know, there's that aspect of it. When you look at meat packing, you can control how much you harvest, but then what you don't harvest has a lifetime associated with that too. You can't continue to feed the cow. You're incurring costs. Ultimately, you get to the point where you can't recover your investment, and so maybe you, and it's happened, you slaughter the cow and dispose of it. Looking at beef or pigs or chickens even. And there is a long lead time to having a harvestable quantity. Not quite as bad as growing trees, but you know, there is a lead time. And when you look at meat packing, you've got a manufacturing operation. And so for them, the issue wasn't so much a distribution problem with the COVID, it was how do they react to and respond to what kind of spacing and distancing and protections you've got to give in a manufacturing and work environment. Now, a lot of manufacturers shut down and then had time to think about it before they came back. Meat packers didn't, because we still had people to feed. So you can sit back and say that's part of why they had a higher experience. I think part of the other experience is the nature of their employees, the communities they live in, that it wasn't just the work environment that was aggravating the situation. But you know, that's, somebody should probably do a research report on that. I'm not going to delve into it.
So you don't think it's threatened? You don't think it's going to dramatically change? The food supply chain still fairly resilient?
I think the food supply chain is resilient. And when you look at what you got to do for COVID, other than the manufacturing aspects of it, where you want to change how many people you have, and food requires, some foods require a lot of manual operation, not automation. It's not like making diapers at Procter & Gamble, okay? In that environment, you've got to cope with it. But the things that you do, the Food Safety Act, the food safety requirements, lot control, lot tracking, freshness date, catch weight, all that kind of stuff, that's there. That's always been there. That doesn't change. And with regard to protecting the food, if you follow those rules, you're going to be fine. And you're going to be fine from a COVID point of view too, because most of the food has to be cooked. The act of cooking it is going to kill the COVID. It's more about the people than it is about the product.
Yeah. Let's go back to technology. Stuff that both of us enjoy. Let's talk about automation. So obviously, you know, manufacturing is going to come back. We're going to see, I've heard from a number of executives, we can't afford US labor. It'll have to be a lot more automated. Clearly with Amazon, we've seen all the Kiva robotic interest. We've heard about drone deliveries. We've heard about autonomous trucks, much more remote field service. Seems like automation has perked up in the last 3-4 months, or is it just me that's picking up those little signals? What are you seeing?
No, it's not you that's just picking up those little signals. And when we look at the automation, there are several flavors or layers of automation. And I'll start with the most restrictive. The most restrictive we've had for a while: conveyor systems, sorters, and whatnot. Part of my prior life was testing the machines that would control that kind of stuff. And that stuff is about as flexible as the concrete and steel it's made out of. Very capable of doing things very high volume. Imagine sorting packages for UPS or US Postal Service delivery in where every package is an individual customer end user home, and the conveyor is moving at 600 feet a minute, and you're sorting that across 50 truck dock doors, because that represents 50 regions of the country you're going to ship to. That's that high volume, that high kind of very focused stuff pretty much requires that lack of flexibility. But that's not that's just one piece of the world, right? So then you get into, we evolved into the idea of using automatic guided vehicles. We're not putting in steel and concrete, but the answer is, yeah, we're putting in copper and markers, because we're laying down tracks, guide paths on the floor. Now, you can change how you want them to behave along that guide path with programming. But if you want to change the guide path, you got to put in some wire. Not as hard as building conveyor by absolute means. I replaced automated conveyor systems with automatic guided vehicle systems when I worked at Procter & Gamble. Then the technology has evolved even more into where we're getting to what now are called autonomous mobile robots. And autonomous mobile robots, think of them as AGVs, automatic guided vehicles, that don't need a wire, and they don't need a marker on the building. They may have some markers periodically just for reference point checkpoints as to where I'm at, but I mean, come on, slap a barcode on a bay pole. How hard is that to do? You know, that's not hard. I've seen it to where some of these machines can be programmed and put into a facility from the time they're uncrated until the time they're up and running is 3 to 4 hours, and they're working for you. Obviously, that's a simple one when you're putting one in instead of a dozen. But those type of environments, those types of machines are capable of learning the environment, learning where the obstacles are, and then responding in real time to obstacles that weren't there before, like a human standing in the way. Or you've got two of them going at each other down the same hallway, and they both recognize, okay, I got to pass on the right, you know, and they both swerve around each other and they get back on in the center. It's pretty cool to watch, actually. So you have those levels of stuff. People have been looking at this kind of stuff for a long time because of the labor issues, not because of the COVID-19. So the COVID-19 thing and people not able to come and come to work has increased the interest in these types of systems. And the new AMRs, autonomous mobile robots, are implementing them is a couple week affair, maybe a month or two. It's not, you know, the 14 months it took me to implement the first automatic guided vehicle system at Procter & Gamble, right? So you can bring them on. Now, they do have different worlds that they work in well. If you're doing pick, pack, and ship, each shipping, you know, filling cartons and whatnot, they're great in your forward picking area. They're not, they can do replenishment to the forward picking area, but they're not going to move pallets. They're not going to move cartons, and they still require an operator. The operator is actually doing the pick. The robot is doing the hauling and the walking. I saw a study a while back where one of the operators was talking about before the AMRs came into his business, he was a picker, and he would pull a cart behind him. And when he was pulling the cart, going from place to place to pick something and put into a box on the cart, he was pulling anywhere from 100 to 500 pounds behind him. And he was walking more than 10 miles a day in a single shift. And he says, with the AMRs, I'm not walking like I was, and I'm certainly not hauling like I was. These things are great. He was really happy. And his throughput and his productivity was more than doubled because of the AMRs. So that's where that comes from, I think.
So let me drill down on a couple of things. Drone delivery, still science fiction, or see it as more and more for reality in the next couple of years?
My challenge to the topic of drones and doing delivery is not can a drone do it. Drones, you know, depending on, I mean, there would be some serious limitations on the weight that they can carry, and there would be some serious limitations on the weather that they can operate in. I mean, think of it.
And then the FAA has got to be worried about.
FAA just yesterday, I heard, I think it was yesterday, maybe the day before, gave Amazon the go-ahead on some of their mobile drone autonomous drone stuff that they want to do. The challenge for me is one drone, one package, one delivery. Are you really making anything better here? Because the drones have got to come from a central place. They're going to fly the distance and then they're going to fly back. Maybe they can do the long haul autonomously, but are you going to have them try to do the delivery autonomously, or all of a sudden you're going to have an operator take over? You know, it's not like it's.
What about autonomous?
It's not like a drone over Afghanistan launching a Hellfire missile. Okay, no, we're not doing that. So,
what about autonomous vehicles, trucks on highways?
I think we got a ways to go. There's a lot of variation there to deal with, but you can kind of look at the AMRs and say, well, they're doing what autonomous vehicles on the highway need to do. They're just doing it in an environment that is not quite as chaotic and one that they can learn. And so with it being one that they can learn, it's repeatable, and it doesn't, if it changes, it's a short reaction. If you're talking about autonomous vehicles going down a highway and dealing with neighborhoods, that to me is a much more complex operation. Doesn't mean we can't get there. I love science fiction. We'll get there someday.
What else? I mean, Tom, you're always so full of innovations and ideas about logistics and supply chains.
Well, innovation wasn't quite one of the words I thought you were going to say I was full of.
But the last 3-4 months, there's been a lot of negative news about supply chains being broken. You sound a lot more pragmatic, even optimistic. Talk about what you see, improving coming out of this.
Well, I think that, I'm not negative about this from a supply chain point of view. I mean, COVID-19 drove a problem to the surface, and the China tariff wars, for lack of a better way of saying it, that all added together. The lockdown brought its own flavor of challenge, but these are all challenges that are just the same stuff we've been playing with, only maybe worse in terms of intensity, severity, frequency. But a lot of it is like, yeah, okay, I can do this. This hurts, but I'll get, this too shall pass.
Great.
Unlike Gandalf and the Balrog in the caves of Moria, this will pass.
Tom, it's always wonderful to talk to you. You're always pragmatic and refreshing to hear somebody say, this too shall pass. What doesn't kill you makes you better.
That's true. But in the military, they used to tell me that it builds character, and by now my character ought to be really good.
Tom, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking the time. Stay healthy, and hope to see you in person one of these days.
Thank you very much. And for all of your listeners that are our age or better, just remember the guy looking into the mirror is a lot younger than the guy looking back.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Bye.